Before we get started, we'd like to thank our sponsors for making this event possible. Special thanks to our platinum sponsor, OLAS. OLAS enables everyone to own a share of AI, specifically autonomous agent economies. We're also excited to highlight our silver sponsors, NIA, empowering decentralized applications and blockchain ecosystems; Venice AI, a private and uncensored alternative to popular AI apps; Mira, unified AI infrastructure, secured by crypto; and Theric, the first on-chain multi-agent system. To learn more about all of our sponsors, check the description below and dive in. Enjoy the show.
Welcome, everybody, to Delphi's Bittensor panel. This was one of the most requested panels, and I'm joined by three of what I believe are the top analysts in the space on this project. So Nick Hotz is a senior analyst at Tangent. Sami is a partner at OSS Capital, and Seth is a research analyst at Messari. And I'm Michael. I'm a researcher at Delphi. All of us are here in our personal capacities, and none of what we're about to say represents investment advice. So let's have a good conversation, sirs. First question, I'll just throw this to the group. Bitcoin was kind of founded, invented as a reaction to the 2008 financial crisis. It kind of solves, I guess you could say, money printing or some of the issues from central banking with programmatic issuance. Ethereum was famously founded as kind of a reaction to, I think, Vitalik like losing a spell in World of Warcraft, and that kind of solves like internet centralization through smart contracts. What problem would you guys say TAO was founded to solve?
I'm happy to kick this one off. I think it's pretty obvious that Bittensor is focusing on decentralizing AI, and everybody knows about the risks of, AGI being developed by a state or one company and having control over that entity. And so, similar to what you said, just like Bitcoin was the counterweight to fiat, Bittensor, in my opinion, is the counterweight to centralized AI. And we're obviously seeing, a lot of the drama and problems that are originating within OpenAI, and the lack of transparency there, the fact that a lot of these AI systems or models are black boxes, and you're starting to see people, become concerned about that. And, Bittensor in a way as well is also like a champion of the open source AI movement, which is bringing transparency to AI. And so I guess that's sort of how, if I had to put a tagline to it, I would say, Bittensor is driving the open source AI movement, which is, fighting against these centralized entities that are trying to like dominate or, control the AI space.
I would probably echo much of what Sami said. I think Sami's probably also much deeper into the lore and history of Bittensor than I am, so I don't know exactly what was originally intended. But I think that's what it's become, at least, is this all alternative platform to develop AI, typically open source AI models. And I think the other component Sami might not have mentioned there is the continuous development of these models. So building incentive structures that hopefully produce continuously more performant or better models.
Yes, stepping back a bit.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Nick. I was just going to say, stepping back a bit, the founders of Bittensor actually had been working on, this protocol, I think back since like 2016. There's like a tweet from Const, which basically, like, I can't remember the exact wording of it, but like the idea of Bittensor has been in the works for almost like 8 years. And, before Bittensor became this network of networks, it originally was just like a text prompting network. And Nick, you might remember the exact date that the network went live. I think it was like 2019. And so that was even before like the ChatGPT moment. And I think it was before the Transformers paper. And so that's one really unique thing that like I like to bring up about Bittensor, because most people, they think of it as this AI meme coin, this scam, but really this has been a project that has been in progress and in development for years now. And over time, kind of the scope of it has increased. So again, Bittensor was just a text prompting network at its very early stages, and then expanded to be kind of a network for digital commodities. And we can get into like what that exactly means, because I know that's a very loaded term. But essentially, like Bittensor now encompasses the entire AI development process, from training to data collection, inference, model optimization. The list goes on.
Yeah, and Michael, you kind of asked about what it was intended to develop, and I think if you asked like Concert Ala today, they would still tell you that it's for AI development, but it's really kind of become something more than that, where you've got these subnets now that really don't have very much at all to do with AI development that are on there, but people have just been able to, with the incentive mechanism that it creates, been able to do even more stuff outside of AI.
Yeah, you could launch Bitcoin. You could build like a Bitcoin subnet, for example. You can really do anything on Bittensor.
Seth,
and we don't say that because that really muddies the water. Sorry, I was just saying that like the reason why like all you hear is like Bittensor's an AI network is because if you do try to say like, oh, Bittensor's this new supercomputer L1, it just like unfortunately loses that AI narrative, but it also just like makes it even more confusing for people. So like when I'm explaining it to someone, I'm like, okay, it's an AI network, but in reality, can be used for anything. Anything that you can write an incentive mechanism for can be a subnet.
So I want to go a bit deeper on just that point. Seth, you mentioned something interesting. Bittensor is kind of a general purpose network, but the kind of core idea, at least in my understanding, is that you tie these models to some sort of metric, and then people compete to provide the best metric, and then the models get better over time because there's this tight feedback loop between what they're submitting and kind of what the rewards that they're getting. And my understanding is that kind of through markets, we can improve these models rapidly and perhaps at an even faster rate than is possible elsewhere. So I guess my question is, one, is that kind of the right way to understand it? And then two, does that not just replicate kind of the system that we already have in the private sector? So like, for example, right now, there's OpenAI, there's Anthropic, there's a few other big players, and all of those guys put out a model, and then depending on how good or bad it is, people pay them to use that model. They raise money off of that model, and then the flywheel churns. How is kind of Bittensor's model different?
Yeah, I'll start on that, I guess. So I think a lot of what you said is correct there, like, or I understand it the same way. You're effectively setting up a game to play. So that's that incentive mechanism that we're talking about. So miners on the network try to compete and be the best at this game. And, the game could be creating an LLM that performs well against a bunch of different benchmarks that are out there. So that's like a very easy example to go through. And I do think in a lot of ways that can produce, the same outcomes that you get in like the private markets that you just went through. Maybe like one thing that's different with Bittensor is compared to like a single AI lab is you do have the ability for other teams to either compete within a single subnet at that same game, or to define something that's maybe a little bit tangential or a little bit different on a different subnet that they think would produce a better outcome or a better model in that regard. So I think it's kind of like a wider, more like horizontal platform, whereas like an Anthropic or OpenAI, they're probably a little bit more narrow in how they think about things. And of course, they do have a ton of funding, but there is some To some extent, they have to stay focused on what they want to experiment with, how they want to build their models. And from a horizontal perspective, they're somewhat limited in that way.
And I think zooming out a little bit as well, Michael, you were asking kind of like what's the difference between the centralized approach versus the decentralized or distributed approach. If you just look in general at the crypto space, crypto incentives have proven to be extremely powerful when pointed towards something very specific. So if you look at like Deepin, for example, when you define the objective or the specific action that you want somebody to go out and do, and what you're able to do there is really benefit from like this permissionless global workforce that is following the rules that you're defining and basically just trying to like satisfy the criteria or optimize for some specific objective function. And so like, I mean, the best example and the most obvious one is Bitcoin, right? It's just like there's this very simple incentive mechanism that says, hey, if you come and solve these SHA-256 hashes, then we'll reward you. Later down the line, you had Helium that was like, hey, if you install this radio, we'll reward you. And Helium, within I think 2 years, became the largest IoT network. Same thing happens with all these compute networks and these GPU networks. They've amassed insanely large amounts of GPUs. And you can then see when you apply this towards like intelligence, or let's just say like AI training, you're able to tap into this like collective intelligence, for like, there might be a better term, but collective intelligence of just individuals all around the world who can help work towards this specific problem, where when you're operating within like an organization, you're constrained to the people who are hired to solve this problem, where that's not really the case in these like distributed and permissionless networks.
Yeah, and kind of springboarding off of that, I think it's really has to do with breaking down the stakeholders into kind of like component parts, where with a normal AI lab, you have everybody working together and then competing externally, but all of the different people doing different functions are working within that one system. Whereas in Bittensor, you have every person who's good at, say, machine learning is a miner. They're all competing against one another, permissionlessly, everybody in the world directly for the same incentives. And then you have validators who are presumably better at like doing business or creating some sort of monetization for whatever commodity that's being produced by the miners. They can focus on that. They're all competing on that playing field. So you have people who are talented at different areas directly competing with their best competitors in the world on the same playing field.
So I guess on that point, Nick, you mentioned like different stakeholders, and this is something that I've been curious to kind of learn more about. Let's say you're kind of indie or like individual AI developer, and you create, I don't know, maybe just the easiest example is like an AI image website where people can go and click a button, type some words, and like generate an image. Is the thinking maybe like a Mid-Journey competitor? Is the idea that developer who kind of spun up that front end could plug in that front end to Bittensor as the back end, and then have a bunch of other developers kind of compete to serve that image? Is that possible? Or maybe if we could talk a bit about how Bittensor can like interact with like hopefully real AI apps that real people use.
Yeah, so that's definitely possible. I think there's a couple of different areas where you could approach using Bittensor in this scenario. So if you created the app, I would say you're kind of like on the validator side. You're producing an end product. You want to monetize that product. Okay, maybe you can come to Bittensor for getting cheaper access to the commodities that you need on the back end in order to provide that product to people. So maybe you need inferencing, maybe you need file storage, maybe you need data scraping to produce a good model, you need training. You could go to Bittensor for all of those different services and then have that feed into your end input. On the other hand, if you say, I'm just an expert at making a good text to image model, well, then you can go compete as a miner on the network, and you don't have to worry about monetizing. You don't have to worry about creating a business or a front end or any of these things. You can just say, this is what I'm specialized and good at, and compete there, and be able to earn emissions directly without having to go, work for somebody or monetize your product. And then the last one would be, hey, I'm great at creating incentive landscape designs. I'm going to go work as a subnet owner, and I can maybe create my own subnet where other people can compete to create the best image model.
Maybe on that topic too, Michael, like to your question, if you think of using Bittensor as like a back-end service for your front-end application, like the closed-sourced open AIs, Anthropics of the world, I mean, those do provide good value, clearly. Because they have a very easy API to use. They, you could probably work with them to get some type of SLA if you're using it as like a very mission critical piece of infrastructure in your large enough organization. And there's also other services that they tie in to like, just their API that you call to generate an image. So it's all these other things that make these companies valuable for application developers. And that's something too. I'm not sure Bittensor maybe has at the moment the ability to like create those SLAs, or like how do you think about putting that into your incentive mechanism? I think that's probably challenging to do. It requires like the actual logical structure, but also like the tooling to be able to iterate through those designs and figure out which one works and what doesn't. So what's
an SLA, Seth?
Oh, like a service level agreement. So like, if I'm counting on you to provide like that service, I want to make sure basically every time I ping that API that I get, something back under a certain amount of time, that you'll basically your service will always be up and available. You're never offline. And, for like Bittensor, every miner could leave a specific subnet that you're using, and you don't have any levers to keep them on the network. Whereas if you're a company, you can make sure your servers are up to probably like a higher degree of, you can project at least a higher degree of certainty that you'll be there tomorrow providing the same service to your customers that you have.
Yeah, Seth brings up a good point, and this was something that concerned me a lot when I was focusing on Deepin. And the reason is because there was this initial perception that, end users were going to directly interact with these blockchain networks in order to get the services that they needed. However, what we ended up seeing happening was there were these these businesses that would come in and like build a service on top of the network, and this would be like an abstraction layer where the end user didn't actually have to interact with the blockchain, they didn't have to pay in crypto. This business could offer SLAs, they could help with onboarding and so on. And that's really what we see happening within Deepin. So like there's a lot of, like storage providers that plug into a lot of the storage networks in the back end. And I sort of see that happening the same way within Bittensor, where these validators, they're essentially just building traditional businesses. And, they don't necessarily only need to be plugging into, subnet 1, which is providing like let's say inference. They could also, in order to provide that redundance and like reliability, they could also plug into OpenAI's API. And so I think it's a valid point that Seth brings up. However, the blockchain or like a network's purpose is just to incentivize, and then higher up the stack, you have entities come in and build these services, provide these guarantees. And that's really the job of the validator here within Bittensor.
Nick, did you have anything to add in there?
No, I think Sami pretty much hit on what I was going to say. I mean, I guess I'd more of a question for Sami. If you've heard of anything like that, like is Corcell doing something like that maybe with Vision? I don't actually quite know.
Yeah, you could think of Corcell as this like abstraction layer business that's building on top of Bittensor. They're obviously not charging for the services yet, but they intend to at some point. But I think, yeah, core cell would probably be like the best example of like what I just described within Bittensor.
So Sami, another question then. As like a validator, I'm running my business and I have like 3 different providers I'm tapping into. One is like a subnet on Bittensor. How do, so like from Bittensor's network perspective and like a subnet owner, I want to project that like core cell is using me to power their, production app that has a lot of users. Therefore, I should get TAO emissions to keep things running here on my subnet. How do like validators or like folks interested in like the Bittensor network in general, like TAO holders, how do they know how much of that traffic is actually flowing from core cell to the subnet versus like how much is getting routed to like an OpenAI and those like other redundant networks? Just to like get a sense of like how useful is this subnet to this, web app that actually has users.
Yeah, so something that's unique about Bittensor is all mining and validating happens off chain, which means utilizing the actual commodity or service that a subnet is happening also occurs off chain. So there's no way to really measure activity on chain. And so you do have to rely on validators to provide insight into like off chain network usage. And so validators really are the ones, like they're essentially the gateway or the gatekeepers to a subnet. And so they're best positioned to understand like, how much demand is there for a subnet? What's the revenue potential? What's the revenue opportunity? And, we can get into kind of like what gives TAO inherent value, but essentially to like access a subnet's resource or commodity, you have to be a validator, and validating requires having TAO. And so there's this mechanism that links demand for a subnet's commodity to TAO or, subnet tokens later down the line. And that's kind of like the relay mechanism, right? So like, let's say there was in a world where there's these subnet tokens, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself because we haven't really discussed Dynamic TAO or anything, but I guess just to keep it concise and not go down that rabbit hole, just to answer your question, like validators are the ones who kind of have that insight, and they're the ones who are relaying traffic and usage to end users, and the ones who can end up charging for that service as well.
Before we get into TAO, which I definitely want to talk about, I had kind of one last question on how all of the pieces of the puzzle kind of work. So I guess sticking with my dumb image generation business example, let's say the 4 of us come together and we want to create a competitor to Midjourney. So you come to our website, you type in some text, and you get an image generation. In theory, right, that website could plug into Bittensor, and when a query comes in, we could route it to Bittensor, and a bunch of people can compete to serve that image to us. I'm curious how within the Bittensor network, they would kind of value and rank the different images. Like, how do you, for something as subjective as art, and maybe art is the hardest example, but there's other kind of examples that can be subjective with AI. How do you rank those? And then final question, one of the interesting things about Midjourney and about some of these other AI tools is they're collecting a lot of data. Like every time you use them, they're collecting that data and then maybe training off that data to improve the model and really tightly basically give users what they want. Do TAO's miners capture that same data? And if not, do you see that as a kind of competitive disadvantage?
I can start on the back end of that maybe, and Sami and Nick might be better for the front end of that question. It might differ subnet to subnet, but I think in general, for like the Midjourney example here, that miner needs the query data, of course. Like, so if you're typing in whatever image you want, they of course need that data to process it on the back end there. But unless there's some specific arrangement set up, I don't think they naturally or like in protocol would get like the application data. So like what device is being used, like what the user's looking at, even like if there's a thumbs up or thumbs down on the app, did they like this? I don't think that's necessarily shared with miners. So I would think you'd want to like bake that into the subnet design, the incentive design, or have like some kind of collaboration between those parties. So I think that is like somewhat a disadvantage from like an application building perspective. Maybe
that's fair, and I think I believe so. All the requests would be routed through a validator. So like in Corcel, they're running a validator to a couple of different subnets in order to operate their website. It's definitely true that the miners don't get direct access to any of that. Although I think they have a partnership with one, or they're working off one of the file storage subnets. I might be incorrect about that. That you could provide information to, and then the miners could get that data for training potentially. I'd have to double check on that. In regards to the first question, though, I think that the Midjourney example, I'm not 100% sure how they're working through this. I think that there is some element of human feedback in a couple of them of the reward frameworks. I think that the rest of them is some complex math that I'm not quite sure, involving vectors and all this stuff. I don't know, Sami, you might be able to speak to that better.
Yeah, so one thing to understand about, like, you chose a really good example, Michael. Like, art is, extremely subjective. Like, you might find a piece of art, to be fascinating, while I think it just looks dumb. And so that's partially a reason why, like, that specific application would need to be built on Bittensor. And so when you think about, like, the actual incentive mechanism, there is going to be subjectivity built into it, right? Because, like, you need to define this rule set that the validators can then go out and enforce. And so, this incentive mechanism could say, be rewarding images that are hyper realistic rather than, animated or have like specific filters on it or something. And so miners in that case are, tuning their models or systems to optimize for what this specific subnet is saying is like the best type of image, which is why then you can have another subnet that's competing that has a slightly different incentive mechanism, which is trying to produce the best image models. But again, this subnet team thinks that, a different design for or a different type of like aesthetic for images is more optimal. And so miners are then trying to generate images for that purpose. And then going back to like the idea of like each subnet is a game, and the incentive mechanism is what validators are using to score each miner. At the end of the day, there's like this leaderboard, and the miner that's playing the game the best has the number one spot. And then going back to your Midjourney example, say there was this application that was utilizing a validator's API to tap into this image generation subnet. This validator has insight into the leaderboard. And so they're going to route their jobs to the number one miner within that network. Or they can decide, I'm going to route it to the top 5 miners on this network. And then I, as the validator, am going to choose which one to route to the end user, right? Because like really at the end of the day, either the validator can make that decision or the application can make that decision. And so there's a lot of customizability in terms of like how you want to build a product. But like the core thing to understand is like that a subnet has a defined set of rules and is ranking miners according to that set of rules, similar to a leaderboard. And whoever's highest up on the leaderboard earns the most and will receive most of the organic queries that come in from validators.
So something there, Sami, like you're almost saying like the market, like whoever's using the app kind of decides like which model gets used, because if miner A gets every query routed to them because they're historically giving the users indicating like, we like these images, the other miners we don't really care for, doesn't that just kind of like incentivize all the other miners on that subnet just to kind of use that model that miner A is using and just start implementing that or tweaking it just a little bit? Wouldn't you rather have like more natural exploration of like different models or teams like trying different data sets to build up a different model or fine tuning on different data sets? Or do you think it like kind of always leads to that centralization?
Yeah, Nick might have a better answer for this, but in my opinion, that's exactly what you want within these subnets. You want miners to try to replicate what the top miner is doing, make slight optimizations or tweaks to it, and compete there, right? So like if miner A is doing really well at, fulfilling what this subnet wants, then, other miners are incentivized to go try to like replicate what they're doing and then make slight modifications. And at the end of the day, it's like, I don't care as long, like as a subnet owner, I don't care as long as the miners are playing the game that I'm defining. And so go do whatever you want, go copy someone else's homework, make slight tweaks. But as long as you're doing what I want as a subnet owner, then I'm content. Nick, maybe you can kind of phrase that better.
Yeah, no, I'd echo that. I don't think there's any value to like decentralization on that level. I would point out though that like the miners don't have access to each other's models necessarily. Like all as a miner you're doing is serving answers to a validator. And so the other miners aren't pardoned to even the outputs that you're getting. And they're certainly not pardoned to like whatever model you're using to serve up those responses. So it would have to be that, I mean, there's places where you can see miner responses for some of the subnets. So the miners would have to figure out what the other queries are, and then you try to work backwards from that in order to copy the other, best competitor. And that's not necessarily the easiest task. But yeah, I mean, kind of at the end of the day, though, it's just whoever's providing the best product. And if you're getting closer to the best product, that's probably a good thing on the whole for the validators, for the subnet.
Yeah, and then one thing that's semi kind of related is that it doesn't matter if there's one miner. Like, decentralization isn't really the focus within each subnet. It's more of just like the permissionless aspect. So like if there's one miner that all the jobs are getting routed to, which is providing the majority of the work for the subnet, that's fine. But like as long as there's the opportunity or ability for somebody else to come in and outperform him, then I think the system will function fine. Like for example, if you take this inference subnet, let's say there's this one data center that is mining and they're just so large that they're able to facilitate most of the traffic and like they're getting all the jobs and getting all the rewards. Like I personally don't see a problem with that as long as like the permissionless aspect is still kind of exists. So just a random point.
One last question on this topic. And I know we've been on it for a while. It's one of the areas that I understand the least. So I wanted to really dive deep on it. But with the image generation example, I guess the easiest way to ask the question is, why do we need validators in the Bittensor network? Why can't miners kind of interact directly with applications? Maybe I'm thinking about it as a user. My preferences change all the time. On Monday, I might want my images to be tinted blue. On Tuesday, I might want them to be tinted pink. And today, on Wednesday, I might want orange. And if kind of the objective function or the game parameters stays the same each day, wouldn't I be getting the same tinted image each day, even though you know what I mean? Can the game update kind of dynamically to fit the end application or the end user's preferences? And if not, do you see that as kind of a flaw in the model, or am I not thinking about that right?
Yeah, I think
that would come to the subnet owner, would be the kind of responsible party for determining what the landscape of the game is. And the subnet owner is incentivized by TAO to like want to get the most emissions to their subnet, which you can arguably is the perception of value of their subnet. So if they're creating a better game that's more responsive to what their end users will demand or what validators can get something valuable out of from their subnet, they're going to try to optimize the reward framework that they're playing the game on to suit that need.
And I do think that can change over time, right? Like for individual subnet, that like the coded up incentive mechanism, they can tweak those parameters. It's not like once you code it up and set that incentive design, it's not stuck in stone forever, right? That can be updated after some amount of time.
Yeah, and ideally, like there should really be like one subnet that's dedicated to producing the best image generation models, right? And so how I kind of envision the future is that, so UMA consensus, which is like the consensus mechanism at the subnet level, what it's really doing is incentivizing validators to come to consensus on a way to evaluate something that's subjective. And so in the future, I think like you will see not like one subnet owner in charge of like dictating the rules. There will be like multiple entities kind of like competing to establish the best framework or set of rules. And then kind of like whether it's the market that chooses or through some voting system, that kind of dictates like what the rules at the subnet level are. Like there in my opinion, there shouldn't be like 5 different image generation subnets. There should just be one, and that mechanism is constant, like dynamically adjusting to just be the best, because it's a commodity at the end of the day. And that's sort of like the vision here.
That's super interesting. Thank you, guys. I guess to shift gears a little bit from how the network works to TAO, the token. I've heard TAO described as an AI coin, as an L1 coin, as a DPIN coin, as a meme coin. What is TAO to you guys?
You didn't say generalized version of Bitcoin. That's the one I would have dropped, but we'll float that out there. TAO is a utility token. At this point, it's a utility token that gives the validator access to the bandwidth provided by miners. So any commodity or service that the miner is producing, you need to own and stake TAO as a validator in order to get access to that. And generally, the more TAO that you have staked, the more the miners are going to listen to you, because they're going to get rewarded better for serving responses to the top validators. And so TAO is kind of the intermediary that provides that.
I think that's pretty much spot on.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sami. Sorry.
No, I agree. The only thing I was going to add is TAO is AI money. That's like a funny little tagline that I've been seeing going around. But like in theory, it's actually like it's got potential, right? Because if you envision this like ecosystem that has the inputs that are needed to produce machine intelligence at the end of the day, you could use TAO to get access to any of those inputs, whether it's data, data labeling, data chunking, pre-training, fine-tuning, whatnot. The idea is almost like if your goal at the end of the day is to build some form of intelligence, whether it's a chatbot or some type of application, you could use TAO and get access to each one of those inputs or commodities within a single unified ecosystem. And so at the end of the day, TAO, in my opinion, or Bittensor will provide access to this decentralized AI lab. And that's something that I don't see many people talking about. Like there's a lot of focus on, crypto and AI, and how there's different projects are all focused on like a specific part of the stack, whether it's, again, compute or data scraping and so on. But like Bittensor is this integrated protocol that is just focused on the entire stack. And so TAO, in my opinion, represents, this is going to sound kind of wishy-washy, but like machine intelligence, like artificial intelligence.
Another question on TAO. There's a big kind of narrative that you see on crypto Twitter that TAO is super inflationary. It's got a ton of emissions. So there's obviously like kind of the financial impact of that on, sell pressure on price, but then there's also the more operational issue or question that raises of like, are these emissions being used properly, or are they being wasted? How do you guys kind of think about both of those angles?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, emissions are super high, and that's definitely a concern of mine. It's like very critical that the network allocates the emissions properly and towards something valuable. I don't know if I have the authority to say whether those emissions are going to something useful currently or not. I would say that, given the teams that Bittensor has attracted, I think that you're bound to produce something very cool at some point. But there's, it's definitely a concern. I would say it is partially mitigated by the fact that you do have like 78% of TAO staked right now. So not all of those emissions are actually hitting the market at any given time. But that staking is, pretty much at will. You can unstake, restake within a block. So
and
that's not really an issue.
Who are those stakers? Like, who's staking all of that TAO? I didn't know it was that high.
Yeah, it's a delegated proof of stake model. So it's the validators staking their own TAO, but then I think the majority of it is delegates. So anybody who owns TAO can stake to a validator and get, depending on what their take is, most of that TAO for the staking yield.
Yeah, Nick kind of hit the nail on the head. The biggest risk is that the emissions aren't being allocated efficiently. Right now, the allocation system is basically a set of to be honest, 5 to 10 of the largest validators that are making decisions into how these emissions or which subnets should receive these emissions. Later, probably sometime early next year, there's an upgrade that'll be implemented called Dynamic TAO, which will transition emission allocation to a market-based system. And so ideally, that should kind of solve for some of the inefficiencies when it comes to a human or, like a small group of 5 to 10 people making these decisions. Another thing to kind of point out is I was talking with actually a friend, Chris from Friends Capital, about this emission topic just the other day. And I was doing the math this morning. And so the nominal inflation rate for the next year until the halving, which is in October 2025, is 34% roughly. If you take into account a lot of, let's say a 16% yield from staking, you can get that rate down to roughly 30%. Well, actually, sorry, no. That's if you take into account the emission recycling. You can get it down to 30% because not all the emissions, there's 7,200 TAO theoretically that can be produced every day. That's not actually what's being emitted. We can go into why that's the case if you want. So realistically, there's 30% inflation rate. If you take into account the 16% yield from staking, you can get that, the real inflation rate down to 14%. And then at today's prices, take TAO at $600, that's about $1.6 billion in emissions that will enter, I guess, Bittensor in the next year. And so the bet that you essentially need to make if you want to hold TAO is that are the 50 teams that are operating within Bittensor, all the validators and all the miners, going to create more than $1.6 billion of value? Are the emissions that they're that the $1.6 billion in emissions that they're receiving, are they able to use those to create more than $1.6 billion in of value? And the bet that I'm making is yes, I think that will be the case.
Maybe just to clarify the point on recycling there, because I think it's important. The miners and actually the validators all have a cost to register on the network every time they want to participate on a subnet. And so the miners especially are constantly churning. If you're performing poorly on a subnet and you're not meeting the criteria, you're going to get booted off the network. And then if you want to get back on the network, you have to burn TAO in order to re-register. So there's a skin in the game aspect here where you're only going to register on the network if you think you have a chance at being able to compete and actually earn emissions and not get booted too quickly.
And then going back to what I was talking about related to like, the top validators deciding how emissions get sent to which subnets. Some validators can even vote to recycle at that level, right? So 13% of total emissions at this point in time are currently being recycled. And so that's also like, to Nick's point, there's recycling that happens when miners and validators want to register onto a subnet, and then in other forms of the network as well.
Seth, on the emissions point, how do you think about that? Is it like an existential issue for the network, or is it kind of just a, normal thing that happens during the bootstrapping phase? Where do you kind of fall on that?
I do think it's like a normal piece of bootstrapping a very broad network, especially something that's kind of a deep pinish network. But to Sami's point, it is like, however you like want to calculate exactly what's being emitted or how you think about that, it is up to like the subnet and its components to generate that value that at least matches what's being emitted. So that's how I think about it. And it is, if you do take a look at the emissions curve, it's, very similar to Bitcoin, although the recycling does affect it a little bit. So I think it's like a fairly, it's a comprehensible model if you do want to look at it and think about it yourself. It's very well studied. So I don't think it's actually super complicated. You just have to kind of like Sami said, take a bet on how you see it playing out at the application level.
Yeah, I think Seth said it perfectly. Like, I don't understand really why, like, crypto Twitter was freaking out about emissions. Like, Bitcoin's emissions is the most well-studied, like, emission schedule out there. And at the same time, the emissions are directly related to subnet outputs. And so, like, when the price of TAO goes up, theoretically, the quality of a subnet or its outputs should also go up, because now the miners have more capital to work with. And so take like a training subnet, for example. Like, let's say the price of TAO goes from $500 to $1,000. Their working capital has essentially 2x. So now they can go out there, rent even more GPUs, build a larger cluster, and train an even larger model. And so that's why I say, like, I'm a fan of the high emissions. Like, obviously, if efficiently allocated and used, and if the incentive mechanisms are tight enough to where there's no way to exploit or gamify them. And like, just to be completely honest, all these subnets don't have this fully robust incentive mechanism. So there are opportunities for miners to come in and game the system and basically like extract rewards without really providing value. But the whole intention here is like design an incentive mechanism that's, resistant to a sovereign nation's military. Like, I know that's kind of crazy to think about, but that's really what you want to do.
What does game the system mean? Can you give like an ELA5, like an example of what that would look like?
There's multiple ways on both the miner and the validator perspective. I think like in the early instantiation, and I shouldn't even say early, like a year to 9 months ago, basically every subnet was being gamed, in the sense that like the miners are only responsible for optimizing against whatever reward, framework that the subnet owner has. So they were producing something that was cheap and easy for them to produce, but and met the reward framework, but not exactly what the validator wanted at the end of the day. I would say that doesn't really exist very much anymore. It's kind of up to, again, the subnet owner to create a framework that doesn't allow for gaming on the miner level. And I think they've pretty much figured that out. A little bit later on, probably 6 months ago or something, there was validator gaming. I don't know quite what was going on there. There was weight copying as well, and there still is to an extent, which is arguably a form of gaming. Weight copying is where some of the validators just look at the other validators' decisions for determining which subnet should get which emissions and just say, I'm going to just do what that person did. They don't have to expend any effort to like determine what the different values of the subnets are. And in some cases, they're providing their their delegates with even higher APYs than some of the other validators are. The downside of that is you don't actually talk to the miners when you're doing that, so you don't actually get access to any of the resources that are being provided.
And then touching on, or kind of expanding to what Nick was saying on how miners game the system, I think a perfect example is actually talking about Noose Research's subnet. So Noose is no longer operating a subnet, but they were operating a fine-tuning subnet. And it was one of the most popular subnets, say 6 months ago. And the subnet was essentially incentivizing miners to create an open source version of GPT-4. So the miners were being benchmarked on a data set that was being generated using GPT-4. And so like on paper, these miners were doing exactly what the incentive mechanism was asking them to do. But once you started digging into like the actual models and utilizing the models, like they're complete ass. And this has nothing to do with like Noose, or it more has to do with like miners figuring out how to like receive rewards without necessarily having a end product that is usable, right? So like, would somebody use one of these models that these miners were creating? No, like they actually weren't good at the end of the day, but they were satisfying exactly what the incentive mechanism was asking them to do. And so like, those were some of the struggles that were going into, those are some of the struggles that Noose was dealing with for their subnet. And eventually kind of the subnet just ended up dying.
So the models were essentially like over optimized on the benchmarks. Is that?
Exactly. Like that's one way, for example, for miners to also game the system. But they were really good at doing something in particular, but like as a general purpose model, they weren't actually usable. But yeah, I think how you phrased it is exactly right.
Kind of as a specific example, I remember that on Subnet 1, the before the Revolution upgrade, all of the miners were basically just rephrasing whatever question was asked to them and then parroting it back to the validator, and that was what was scoring the highest on the reward framework at that time. So it was basically useless. Like you would say, "Who's George Washington?" and it would ask, "Who was George Washington?" Something like that.
That's super interesting. I didn't know that. Cool. One other question I have is, one of the things Bittensor has going for it is that it's, on any given day, it's like the biggest AI coin by market cap, by value, and it's definitely one of the more well known. So I think that kind of helps it on like the narrative side, just with sheer publicity and eyeballs. But then there's the question of like, does that actually kind of help Bittensor build out a network effect? And I think, throughout crypto's history, Bitcoin was the first crypto and it's got the biggest market cap. Ethereum was the first smart contract platform. It's got the second biggest market cap. So it seems like first mover advantage is like a real thing in crypto, at least historically. Do you guys think that that's something that will kind of apply to this vertical within decentralized AI? How do you guys kind of think about first mover advantage?
I mean, I think definitely yes. In a lot of the ways that you kind of just said, like if you have a bunch of community members who have familiarity with a project, with the people involved, with the code, you have an endowment effect from holding TAO, the asset. You have this kind of longer time frame, just normal lindiness, or the Bittensor code or subnet model being seen as the standard. Like all those things are going to contribute to a network effect and towards people choosing Bittensor over other options.
Yeah, and when I think about what Bittensor's network effect is, or what its mode is at the end of the day, it's the AI developers that are really mining in this ecosystem. And Bittensor having the first mover advantage has made it really easy when it comes to AI developers choosing which protocol to contribute to. Like back then there was, like a year ago, there was only one option. Like if you wanted to contribute, if you wanted to be doing like decentralized machine learning, you had to go to Bittensor. And from that point, there's been this like snowball effect where and I've seen this firsthand talking to founders who are interested in launching or contributing to Bittensor, and I'll ask them like, why are you considering Bittensor? And their response is like, I want to go where the other really smart PhDs and AI researchers are, and right now that's Bittensor. So there's this network effect on that front, and I think, yeah, I guess just kind of to summarize. That will continue to kind of improve Bittensor, continue to kind of strengthen the moat, and make it really difficult for other protocols to compete. Because as TAO also becomes more liquid, then there's this impact where a lot of miners are also going to go to the ecosystem where the native asset has the deepest liquidity, because in that sense, they're able to then convert to US dollars much more easily. And so I think that's also like a benefit of being the first mover. So I don't see Bittensor really giving that up, honestly.
Sami, you mentioned something earlier that I hadn't ever heard said. You said, if TAO goes from 500 to 1,000, I think you said miners working capital effectively 2x's. That would seem like it would create somewhat of a network effect, or that, that could be like a first mover advantage. If TAO just has a way larger valuation than other competitors, that curious on that. Yeah. How do you think about that?
Yeah, exactly. This kind of goes back to like, it touches on the emission point as well, where contributors want to go where they're going to be compensated the most for their services. And so the ecosystem that has the most attention, where the native asset is performing the best, is where a lot of people are going to be attracted to, whether it's subnet owners or miners. You're going to want to go where all the action is and where you can get paid most handsomely. And so I think there's also like a benefit or a network effect there, or this flywheel. And this is sort of a flywheel that a lot of deepens benefit from, where it's like as the token price goes up, there's more contributors that come in, and same thing applies to these AI networks.
I'd push back a little bit on that point, because I think there is this effect kind of similar to like Bitcoin's difficulty adjustment, where when the price of TAO goes up, yes, you have more emissions to all of the stakeholders, but you also are kind of just like, I think of it like an economy, like you're funding worse stakeholders potentially, or marginally on the margin, the stakeholder that gets funded is not as high quality as the ones that were already there. So you have this washout effect where the more capital that comes in, the less efficient the system is getting over time. And then you have, eventually likely a washout in price that kind of concentrates back into the more effective, efficient, value creating subnets. As the price goes down, ideally stabilizes it, and you kind of have this cycle that is, I wouldn't say a flywheel, I'd say it's like counterbalancing, it's counter-cyclical.
Nick, I think I agree with you, but I want to see what you think about this. When, let's say TAO price goes up and miner emissions on a specific subnet also go up, would that not attract more competitors to come in? Competitors that are potentially higher caliber than the ones that are operating. And so in that sense, there could be more efficient allocation happening within a subnet, where now somebody who's more deserving of the emissions has entered this playing field.
That's a good point, actually. I guess I was thinking about it from an economic level, where there's kind of a fixed supply of talent, whereas in this case, if it's a growing pie, you don't really have that concern, because you can bring on higher quality talent that previously was getting paid by somebody outside of the ecosystem. So yeah, I guess that's a fair point. I do think in general, it holds at like a system-wide level. Like if the price goes down, you're going to see concentration. If it goes up, you're going to see diversification, and that's going to eventually fragment value. But I do take that point too.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like how you put it, Sammy, if you think of like the USD value of TAO as kind of like the clearing price for, the next marginal smart cracked AI developer to come do something on Bittensor, there's some kind of range there, and once it hits that price, they're attracted to come in and likely outcompete some miner on a certain subnet. So that's also how I think about it.
So I want to ask you guys kind of a spicy one here. I tweeted out maybe like a month ago, half shit post, half real tweet, but somewhat critical of TAO. And then the four of us all got into a little exchange. And one of the things I said was basically, Noose Research was, kind of a star in the, decentralized AI space. They were very much aligned with Bittensor for a while. And then they've since left to do their own thing. It's kind of unclear whether they directly compete or indirectly compete with Bittensor, but kind of the higher level question that I think it presents is, what's stopping individual AI researchers or applications kind of using TAO to bootstrap, and then once they get big enough, maybe leaving to do their own thing. And Seth, I kind of want to bring you in here because I thought your response was really thoughtful. You talked a lot about kind of like the opportunity cost, right, of staying on Bittensor as a developer or as a AI application, or leaving. So maybe if you could kind of like steelman that view, and I'd love if Nick and Sami, if you guys could kind of respond to that.
Sure. I think maybe your point to steelman is, if you're maybe to go back to like the Mid-Journey-ish kind of example, if you're creating a model that generates images, and at the application level, you understand that also fairly well, like how that side of things work as well. You're not just focused on building the best ML model. Then I think at some point you do just think, okay, I understand the application side. Maybe I even know some of the validators that build these applications. I can continue to create models that people like. I'm doing all the work on the subnet anyway. I'm the best miner on the subnet, getting all the TAO emissions. People are just taking my model or somehow figuring out how to somewhat recreate my model and use that to their benefit. Why not just, kind of close this thing up and just go off and build my own, Web 2 application that has nothing to do with crypto? Or, if I want to stay in this domain of crypto AI, start something that's my own network and go through that process. And I think there's probably at some point, if you have enough TAO, you could sell that for yourself and start your own project, or kind of like I said in my post, there's probably lots of ways you could get funding to do that. So at some point, if you're just depending on TAO emissions to fund your operation, you're not seeing any revenue that comes from the applications that these validators are hosting. If that kind of remains disjointed and you want to vertically integrate a bit more and capture more of that value, or control the application level more because you think you have a better idea of how to build it, or some other edge on distribution, I think that's things I would constantly be thinking about if I was a miner on one of these networks.
Yeah, like one thing I like to always bring up when this topic is discussed is that I don't know the exact percentage. I'm kind of making this number up, but like 99% of people are not meant to be entrepreneurs, right? Like not everyone is best suited or has the skill set to go run their own Web 2 company or build their own protocol. Majority of people have this very niche skill set and, want to make money providing that as a service. And so that's one who I see, or kind of the persona that I envision a lot of miners being, right? Like they don't want to go launch their own application. Like they're getting paid very handsomely for just doing something very specific, which is training machine learning models, for example. If they want to go develop their own network, now they have to go hire a team. They have to think about incentive mechanism design. They have to deal with exchanges. They have to do a tokenomic design. There's so many other things that go into it. And then similar with building a Web 2 application, But now let's imagine you're like a subnet owner. And as a subnet owner, like you really don't own anything. You don't own the infrastructure. You don't know what models the miners are running. And then the validators are the ones who control distribution. So you also don't have any contact with the actual end usage applications. So, okay, you decide you want to go spin out into your own standalone network. Well, good luck, because now you have to convince all the miners to follow you, or you have to bootstrap the supply side from zero. And then you also have to do the whole BD side now, which is go out and find users. But like the thing that I agree with Seth on is like, say you are this miner who has developed this really strong model and you do decide to partner with a validator who has distribution, then yeah, you could just make like a kind of like an off-chain deal and just, have them pay for your services. But also like, why not at that point continue to mine on a subnet? Because it's just like this free cash flow stream that I don't see why somebody would even if you decide to go build your own product, your own network. It's like Bittensor will always pay for this specific service, and if you're able to offer it while doing something else, then I think most people would still do that.
Yeah, the only thing that else I would add, I think Sami had hit the nail on the head pretty well there, is from a miner perspective, definitely still true. But after Dynamic TAO, you have this other element where you have the token involved. So there is an extra kind of layer of reputation or incentive for at least the subnet owner to kind of stay involved, because if you do get successful with a subnet, I don't know, maybe you're also running the miners and or running miners and validators on that subnet. You have this and like a reputational incentive to keep that thing running, because if you go off somewhere else, you're basically rugging the token, and that breeds a lot of negativity, and probably a lot of the other miners and validators who are on your subnet aren't going to be happy about that and are less likely to follow you and be able to allow you to create the same thing you had previously on Bittensor. So that adds another kind of lock-in element there, I would say.
Quick point of pushback, maybe something that's like probably hard to quantify exactly, but Sami, you're talking about like, if you are, most people aren't cut out to be entrepreneurs or founders, and the people that are might, want to leave Bittensor. And I think that's a problem, right? Like we just talked through like the moats and kind of the network effect of Bittensor is keeping super talented people. And so if the incentives don't cut it for the top, layer of ML and AI folks, then you are always kind of like, you're not going to keep those teams that are at the top, or you're not going to be able to attract them or keep them for some amount of time. So again, can't really put numbers on that, but that's also something that I think is important to discuss.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But would you say like a similar dynamic to what you described exists within like smart contract platforms on Solana and Ethereum, where the top teams eventually spin out into their own app chain, or do they stay in the ecosystem because there's certain advantages to doing so, and the network effect and the tooling and the users, and I guess I believe that Bittensor provides certain advantages. It provides miners. It provides I can't really think. I think, well, in my opinion, miners really is the like core reason for teams to stay. But yeah, curious how you think about that, because I see it to be almost like a similar dynamic where like the top teams don't spin out on Solana. They choose to stay in there for specific reasons. Why would that not be the case with subnets, especially if they will have their own token after this Dynamic TAO upgrade?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think we're seeing that play out right now. Like there are Solana like network extensions and L2s coming out that are very, like domain specific or like kind of application specific. And the Ethereum smart contract platform has gone through this for a while, and it's still going to continue on. So there are reasons to stay on like a base layer like that. And maybe it's like different from Bittensor, since these are like generalized smart contract platforms that have the ability to have applications on top of them that are tied into the infrastructure that they leverage, whereas it's not the case for Bittensor. There's no DeFi ecosystem or anything that's kind of integrated within the protocol. But yeah, I think it's a fair question. And there are teams, like especially in the DeFi domain, that see the benefit of staying on a Solana L1 and not spinning out. So I don't have like a definitive answer for that, but I think it is something that's going to continue on Bittensor. So
Yeah, I agree.
One question I have, guys. We talked a lot about kind of history of Bittensor, where it's at right now, strengths, weaknesses, etc. Looking forward, what are you guys most excited about? What are you, as you're constantly reevaluating your thesis? What's something that you're kind of waiting for to happen that would reaffirm or strengthen or give you even more conviction, in Bittensor? Is there a big milestone or upgrade, or could be anything?
I want to use it for something cool. I want to do something cool that uses Bittensor on the back end. I mean, you've got a couple of examples like that. Corcel, definitely the highest quality thing that's a consumer facing thing. But most of the applications right now are kind of B2B, or like they're AI kind of technical infrastructure things. And I want to see something that comes out of this that is using those products or whatever the miners are doing and makes something awesome and magical that I can use as a consumer. And I don't have to just look at obscure charts about loss curves and stuff on AI models to know that this thing has been successful in the past. Having something tangible that I could see this getting product market fit coming out of the ecosystem would be the one thing that I'm really excited about.
maybe like one thing I've been looking at is there's a team called Macrocosmos that has, I think it's 5 different subnets. They effectively, if you look at those subnets, they kind of make up the core components of how you end up building an AI model. And they're all on different subnets, and you can think of it as like fairly disjointed right now. But something I think they're thinking about, and something I've always kind of thought about with Bittensor is, it's like a way to build an AI lab kind of on this substrate. And they kind of have all these pieces. And I think kind of the next phase that they're thinking about is, okay, how do we integrate these together a little bit more from like almost a subnet perspective? How do we get these pieces to coordinate and work together like a typical AI lab would do? And then also like, how do we, for the data subnet, how do we kind of make that potentially like a standalone service that maybe like Nick was talking about, like there's a product that sits on top of it that maybe it's B2B, maybe it is B2C, but something that's useful that people use. So that's kind of like the next phase that I think is important for this team in particular.
Yeah, something that I'm looking forward to is the first training subnet that produces a model that's truly state of the art within open source. And so, like having a model produced within Bittensor that is more performant than Llama or, like Noose's Hermes models. I think that would be a remarkable moment. I'm also looking forward to Dynamic TAO. I think Dynamic TAO is just going to unlock this huge potential within the network where we're sort of in this like era, like we're going to look back at this era of Bittensor and almost like think of it as the dark ages where emissions were being allocated by like a handful of people. It wasn't very efficient. And then like, Dynamic TAO is like the enlightenment era. I don't even know if that's a thing, but it just sounds cool. But it's like this time where like, everything is good and emissions are being allocated efficiently. And there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on that front, but it's something that I'm really looking forward to. And yeah, I guess lastly, I'm looking forward to TAO at $10,000. So
there we go. That's a good one. Final question for you guys. This pod will be, probably, the number one piece of content people look to on Bittensor. But outside of this, is there one resource or report, piece of content that you guys would point people towards to learn more about Bittensor and TAO? And yes, we can do self-shills if you'd like.
So I'll start with self-shilling. Created a website with a team called Wombo that highlights all the achievements within Bittensor and also covers the entire subnet landscape. And so I think that's a great starting point for people who want to learn more about subnets, but also have insight into like what these subnets are actually achieving. Outside of that, there's select few people I would recommend following on Twitter. Joseph Jacks is a great one. Obviously, I got to shill Nick and Seth a little bit as well. Yeah, I think Const, some of the TensorPlex guys are great follows. The Macrocosmos team has a great blog. I would recommend checking that out. On-Chain Outpost by Brody has been putting out a lot of great content. So there really isn't like one resource, just kind of a handful that I'd recommend people check out.
Yeah, I think all those are good mentions. Sami wrote a huge report, or a couple reports on Bittensor while you were at Messari, so I would say those are great. There's also a tool out there called the Velt, which was built by Dustin Tiander. It's has a good AI feed, so if you just want general AI information, a lot of it's going to be Bittensor related because that does dominate the timeline. But it's a good feed, and you can also chat with it as a good chat application tied into it. So I think that's also something to check out.
Sami forgot to shill himself in terms of a follow on Twitter. So he was his original report. I think he was the first person I saw in the crypto ecosystem talking about it. That's where I kind of really picked it up in the first place. So he's a good one just by himself as a resource. Other than that, I mean, I would say go to the Discord, attend some of the novelty searches on Thursdays, their AMAs, like that's what really will get you kind of tangibly understanding what the devs, what the subnet teams, what the Open Tensor Foundation are working towards and what they're excited about.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you guys all for being here and for doing this. I really appreciate it. And this was a great conversation.
Yeah, had a lot of fun. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, it's good.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for tuning in.